All right. Okay. So, World War I. We're going to break this up into several lectures. Today we're going to primarily be talking about the initial phases of the war, both on the Western Front and the Eastern Front. Activities that go on in the Balkans, other than the initial start of the war, will only be touched on peripherally. And that's because, in part, we only have an hour. We only have an hour each class period. And the settlement at Versailles is going to deal specifically with the creation of new states in this area. And so we'll have plenty of occasion for talking about it in 2 lectures' time. Other things that are going to be only tangentially referenced. This is a world war, for those of you who know something about this conflict. The British will be probing the Ottoman Empire in places like Baghdad and in the Arabian Peninsula. That is going to be largely saved for our later lectures on decolonization, the death of the European empires, because this is one of the really precipitating places where we see the rise of Arab nationalism. And of course, the very thorny question of the fate of Palestine, which is still very much in the news today. So we'll be talking about all of that stuff at a later date. We have plenty to talk about, and certainly on the Western Front, this is rather critical because these are going to be the deciding powers. Even on the Eastern Front, spoiler alert, the Tsar's empire is not going to last, and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is going to take power, and he's going to take them out of the war. And so they will not be invited to the peace settlement, and a cordon sanitaire will be set up to keep Russia, the new Soviet republics and whatnot, out. And so we will have occasion to talk about all of that naturally. But if you look at your PowerPoint, and again, my apologies for our technology difficulties today. I will have to put in another request to have them come and look at our machine here. You'll see that on the first slide, we have our warring blocks set up. We talked about this last time. Austria is looking to smack down Serbia. Serbia, which is a client state of which major power? Let's just see how we're doing here. You can blur it out. Russia. Russia is the protector of Orthodox Slavic peoples down there. It was in their many wars that we talked about in the 19th century against the Ottomans that they created these client states, right? Helped to create them. I wouldn't say the Russians did it entirely. There was a lot of local movements. Remember, we talked about these were in large part the resurrections of peoples and kingdoms that had existed prior to the Ottoman invasion of the Balkans, which had occurred in the 14th and 15th centuries. Okay? So, the Russians are going to come in on the Serbian side. Okay? Austria is going to declare war at the very end of August. If you want to, or at the very end of July. If you flip to the next slide, you'll see that it was August 28th, the declaration of war on Serbia. Russia, and I'm just going to use the names of the countries so that I don't have to say like Petan, Foch, Asquith, Tsar. I'm just going to use the names of the countries. Saves a little bit of time, make it easier. Russia is going to order general mobilization. Okay, remember, we said that Russia's main weakness as an ally is that it's a really big country. There aren't a lot of railroad tracks yet, and so they're going to be very slow to get to the front, right? So they declare general mobilization. This is stopped briefly when a telegram comes in from the Tsar's cousin, who is the leader of which country? Germany, right? And he says, gosh, are we really going to do this? Are we really going to blow this up? The German Empire, the German Reich was looking for a localized war. They wanted to preserve Austria-Hungary in being. Remember, this was the basis for the little Germany, right? That's dominated by Prussia, right? The leadership are the Prussian younger class, okay? They don't want a world war, right? They would prefer a localized conflict in the Balkans that sees Austria smack down Serbia, as happened previously when Russia had been incapacitated temporarily, politically and militarily by their defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, right after the turn of the century, which we talked about last time. And so the Germans are hoping that once again, by stepping forward and saying, we have Austria's back here, the blank check, this is what it's called. The Austrians turn to the Germans and they say, can we count on you in this moment of trial for us? Because remember, the Austrian Habsburgs view this as the fate of the dynasty being in jeopardy, right? They have their own Slavic populations who are increasingly agitated by, in large part, the nationalist movements next door who have successfully created their own states, right? And so this is considered an existential threat. And of course, the Serbian government, the Serbian military had been involved in these secret groups, these secret society groups, who had ultimately helped murder Franz Ferdinand, right? So they view it as we need to smack down the Serbs before things get completely out of hand. The Germans, for their own reasons, say we're going to back Austria. We don't want a war, and we hope that the Russians will back down. The Russians are not going to back down. The Russians are in a pretty strong position by this point. They've been able to rearm. They've been working very hard at industrializing. They actually mobilize much quicker than everyone is expecting. I'll talk about that in a minute with regards to the German strategic war plan called the Schlieffen Plan. The Russians, when the Tsar receives his cousin's telegram saying, gosh, are we really gonna go to war over this? He countermands his own order and says, you know what, partial mobilization. Let's see what happens here. The generals in Paris freak out. His own general staff freaks out and says, no. Remember, we have the joint military planning, right? In these military alliances, these are finely tuned military plans. They all freak out and go, no, we have all these plans. You can't do that. We're expecting you to be invading, to get the Germans to deploy corps away from our front. And so he quickly reverses himself. So this is just one of those ways that, yes, they could have chosen otherwise. World War I was not inevitable, but they had set up a series of interlocking structures and incentives that made war increasingly likely, even when they didn't even want to push the button. The Kaiser himself will get cold feet and ask, gosh, is there any way that we can just keep this war localized and not attack France? And he's told by his generals, that's completely impossible. Because if we hesitate and the Russians do choose to come in, we'll have lost we need to be on the front foot. We can't fight a war on two fronts forever. We need to get in there quickly, knock the French out, race back across the continent, and confront the Russians. So they engage what's called the Schlieffen Plan. Now the Schlieffen Plan was, signed by the man whose name it bears, Schlieffen. Schlieffen dies about a decade and a half before the actual war, and the plans are handed off to Moltke the Younger. We met Moltke Sr., his uncle. He's the one who led Prussia to those fabulous victories against the Austrians and then the French back in the 60s and 70s that we talked about, the wars of German unification. He was the mastermind of those battle plans, those strategic war plans. Okay, so this is his nephew. The plan is to sweep around French fortifications, through Belgium, hook down, grab Paris, knock the government down, get a quick peace, and race back across, right? They can't get bogged down. Okay, so the July crisis, the Archduke's been killed. Serbia is basically trying to avoid a war. They don't really want to be smashed to pieces. They know that this is going to be very dicey. But the Austrians craft their, if there's one state that really does want a war at this point, it is Austria. It's often said that Germany wanted a war. It's not obvious that Germany wanted a war. It's clear that Germany was okay with a war and would have preferred a regional war, but would have preferred, frankly, no war at all. Austria is the only state that really had to hazard a gamble militarily at this point. They viewed it as an existential crisis. And they craft their ultimatum to Serbia in a manner in which it is guaranteed to be rejected. And actually, when the Serbians deliver their response to the Austrian ambassador doesn't even open it. He says something along the lines of, "Gentlemen, I have the honor of informing you that the severing of our diplomatic relations as of this point is a fait accompli. It doesn't matter what you say." And of course, they couldn't, when you open it and you read it, you find that they tried to, some of these we can do, some of these we can't do, We talked about the ultimatum and the demands last time, if you'll recall. What's unclear at this point is how the British are going to react to all this. We talked about the Treaty of London, which had been signed back in the 1830s. And all of the signatories had promised to uphold the sovereignty, to respect. That's what it was. It was respect. Respect, and the language is important there. It was to respect the sovereignty, the independence and sovereignty of Belgium. We talked about why the British General Staff and why the British government choose to interpret this as they must protect Belgium. They recognize that the Germans are going to A, defeat France, B, defeat Russia, and then C, be masters of the continent, from which place and point they can then challenge global British maritime dominance, which is considered totally unacceptable. So, they use the opportunity of the invasion of Belgium to enter the war. The general staffs had already worked out in advance war plans. The French were counting on them. Asquith right at the end starts to get cold feet. He's a prime minister, and he's worried about he's worried about his domestic politics. He's worried that he's going to split the liberal government and destroy his own government. And then there'd be elections. I don't know if you guys know how parliamentary systems work. Okay. But he's told by the generals, look, the French are counting on us. They've already deployed their fleet to the Mediterranean. If we don't do what we have agreed ahead of time that we're going to do in the event of a war, the Germans will control the North Sea. They'll take the North Sea Channel ports, and that's unacceptable to us. Anyway, we have to get into the war, and the British do. They deliver an ultimatum to the Germans, and they say, you have 1 day to confirm for us that you will respect Belgian neutrality. You will remove your troops. If they don't do it, Britain is at war. Quickly, very quickly, the Germans smash through Belgium. The Belgians do put up a fight, and that does actually wind up buying the French a little bit of time. Not that it really matters. What really matters is that Moltke the Younger, frankly, loses his nerve. This is a wild gamble. The Schlieffen plan is considered a wild gamble. And it's very aggressively loaded. It's very skewed to the right wing. It's said that Schlieffen's dying words on his deathbed were, it must come to a fight, but make the right wing as strong as possible. So to load it up on the side and sweep down into Paris and just mow everything down in your path, right? And to let the French attack into Alsace and Lorraine and get them pulled into Germany and bogged down, right? Because you take Paris, you've completely cut them off. They're surrounded. This is essentially what happens at Sedan, which we talked about last time, or 2 times ago. But he panics. And he starts pulling Army Corps, away from the right wing to reinforce what they called the Eastern Front, which was really the center line on the border there. And then when he receives reports that the Russians are actually mobilizing a lot quicker than we thought, and maybe they're going to be here before we know it, he pulls more Army Corps away from the right wing over there, so that the right wing Army Corps is essentially not strong enough to smash through the final line of French defenders. They can literally see the Eiffel Tower in the distance, the German armies can, when the First Battle of the Marne happens. The French are literally using taxis. Remember, we talked about the Germans having set up their rail lines specifically with battle in mind. The French do not. They're literally commandeering taxis, hundreds of taxis off the roads of Paris, and using them to shuttle reservists to the line to hold the Marne. And they do. And basically, the front stabilizes there, just inside of France, up along Belgium. The sides start racing north and south to dig in. This is the race to the sea. This is going to become the Western Front. Trenches, barbed wire, earthworks. They will not move to either side more than about 10 miles for the next few years. All those offensives that you're going to read about in your reading, all the ones that I'm going to talk about, these battles, they never grab more than a few hundred yards generally. A big breakthrough would be considered, a quarter mile or something. And it was generally very hard to reinforce and resupply and hold on to those gains because no man's land, that area in between the lines, is so completely cratered and blasted, full barbed wire. It was too hard to get supplies up to your guys, get reinforcements up there. Because then a second line, right? Let's say some of us make it across the line, right? And we take this trench. Well, there's more lines of Germans or French coming, right? And we're not being reinforced. We'll all be killed, and we basically wind up back where we started. It's very rare for any real movement to ever happen. And this is why, after a year, so this is all happening in September, the Battle of the Marne, the stabilization of the lines, that's all occurring in September, October, November. By April of the following year, the British have essentially had enough. Remember, they did not have a large standing army. They had an army of about 75,000 men. The expeditionary force is quickly being chewed up, right? I mean, we're talking about losing tens of thousands of men in a day in these battles. And the British public there are a lot of volunteers stepping forward, but they don't want to try and conscript people, number one, even though they eventually will. Number two, they have domestic concerns of their own. This is something I haven't really had a chance to talk about yet, and I am going to talk about it in the 1960s and 70s, but the British have an Irish problem, right? They have a small problem called the Irish, right? An unreliable ethnic minority of their own. And in fact, the Irish are going to rise up during this war. So the British are very conscious of the dangerous political situation they have at home, right? And so Churchill and his admiralty come up with really the only Allied strategic idea of the entire war. Remember, strategy is the big picture stuff. Tactics is your local way of carrying out that element of your strategy that you want to see accomplished. Because really, they're just mowing each other down on the Western Front, just taking turns cutting each other down. Churchill and the Admiralty decide to attempt an eastern maneuver. The Ottomans have come into the war. They come in, I believe, November. It's not critical that you know exactly when they came in, but they come in shortly after. Italy is going to be bribed in as well very quickly. Italy had been I guess I'll just do this really quick. I'll bring Italy into the war real quick. Italy had been technically allied to Germany and Austria, but it was a defensive alliance, okay? It was a defensive alliance. And so when the war breaks out, the Italian government says, well, technically speaking, you guys were the aggressors. Serbia, or then Austria declared war first, and then Germany declares war. They declare war before the Russians, actually, because the Russians are just mobilizing, and so the Germans, when they won't cease mobilizing, because the Tsar, of course, is trying to buy time. He and his government are strong, like, yeah, it's just precaution, just military drills, just exercising, and the Germans are like, okay, we're not buying that, we're going to war against you. So really, Italy takes this opportunity. They say, well, guys, we'd love to come in, but we're looking over this treaty, and it looks like you guys started this war, and I guess we could help you, but gosh, Austria, how about like Trieste, and Austria's like, no, that's my territory, you can't have that. And so Italy goes, no problem. So they go to the British, and they say, hey, if we help you, can we have like Trieste? And Britain goes, sure. You can have all the land you want of the Habsburg domains there. And so Italy is bribed into the war, essentially. Actually, one of the interesting elements of the war is propaganda and the spreading around of money. I don't really have a ton. I'll talk a little bit about this in our next lecture when I bring the Americans in, but Avanti was the socialist newspaper of Italy. Italy had a vibrant socialist movement and communist movement. In fact, after World War II, the largest political party will be the communists. But Benito Mussolini is the editor of Avanti, and he's fired for encouraging the Italians to go to war. The French government secretly funnels him money to start a new paper and a new political party, which eventually becomes the fascist party. Whoops. Okay, so things are going, so Gallipoli. So the Ottomans come in because they recognize if the Allies win, if Russia wins, it's the end of the Ottoman Empire. Russia's going to get the Straits. They're going to break up the rest of the empire there. Remember, Italy and all them, they've all been gobbling up pieces of it in North Africa. The British already control Egypt. It's going to be the end. So they come in on the side of the Germans. Churchill and the Admiralty decide, what if we come in and attack the Gallipoli Peninsula there? We'll use our naval power to bombard the fortresses. We'll take the Dardanelles Straits there, and then we'll be able to provision the Russian army. Because the Russians have a lot of manpower, and they actually have a couple of decent generals like Brusilov, who we'll meet next time. But sadly, they are horribly deficient in industrial capacity. I believe it was you last time who had mentioned they're telling guys, okay, we don't have enough rifles for all of you, so you have the rifle and you just run behind him, and when he gets shot and killed, you just pick up his rifle. They've got no boots, not proper uniforms. They just don't have the industrial manufacturing capacity to arm and provision millions of guys on a running basis here. We're talking about Napoleon when he wins the Battle of Austerlitz. His armies are going to win that battle by firing about 1,000 artillery shells. About 1,000 total. These armies are now using about 10,000 shells a day. So manufacturing capacity is huge, right? Concentrated artillery is going to become the weapon of choice now. Machine guns and concentrated artillery. Things like cavalry, right? Things like cavalry. You are going to see some cavalry skirmishes go on. It's mostly on the eastern front where things are a little more out in the open. On the western front, this is where people finally accept that horses are useless. The French armies, if you watch them, if you look at pictures, there's no videos of it. It's not that I'm aware. Not that I'm aware of. They might have had some kind of like slow type of video, but I've seen pictures. The armies that Napoleon marches to battle with are like not that indistinguishable from the armies the French marched to war with in World War I. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. The white gloves and the sabers, and they're on the horses and stuff. Like, it was just so bizarre. Like, they really did not understand what they were going to be going into here. Gallipoli. Gallipoli would have been successful, but for very, very bad intelligence. The British sail in there. They believe that the harbor must be mined. It must be mined in 100 different places. We're going to lose one ship. Actually, there were very few mines. They hit really one of the only mines. Their lead ship hits a mine. It's one of the only ones out there, and it freaks out the commander of the British Naval Expeditionary Force. And he holds up. He says, "We're not going to try and go to the harbor. We're going to try and bombard them from a distance." And it takes forever, and they don't have enough shells, and yada, yada, yada. And the German commanders, there's a German commanding the Ottoman forces at this point, remarks later that it was a good thing that the British really didn't focus very hard here, because they could have overran it very easily. But they don't, and they allow for the Germans and the Austrians and the Ottomans to reinforce it, and it turns into a bloodbath, the Battle of Gallipoli. Most of the deaths are going to be Australian. This is sort of one of the Australian national myths. It was a nation-making moment. So Gallipoli fails. Churchill is fired, even though honestly the strategic idea was sound. Tactically, it was very clumsily carried out. That was 1915. That was the big Allied idea. That was really the only Entente idea that they had strategically, other than, well, we'll just try and outkill the Germans on the Western Front and hope that Russia can stay on its feet long enough, because they can't really provision Russia very well, except overland up through the Baltic area ports, right? And so the Battle of Verdun, the Germans, so this is 1916 now, the Germans are realizing that they can't go on. They can't go on. So the war is going pretty well, all things considered. In the Balkans, the war is going pretty well because they have Bulgaria and the Austrians and the Turks all fighting down there, helping tie down the Russians. So things are going well there. On the Western Front, though, they're getting bled just as badly as the French. There's no end in sight. The lines haven't moved. We're 2 years into the war. The lines really haven't moved. And so the German General Staff, they decide they're going to try and bleed the French away. They decide to choose a strategic location, which is somewhat critical. Verdun, the fortresses at Verdun are very critical. They guard the approaches to Paris. They decide that we'll attack here and force the French to commit all their forces to defend it. And then we will mass our artillery there and just try and basically bleed the French into submission. And it does not work. It is technically a victory for the French, but it's what we call a Pyrrhic victory. Anyone know who Pyrrhus was? Yes. So it's a victory. I cannot afford such another such victory, right? Costs far too much. Verdun is actually where Tolkien got that line, "They shall not pass." That was Pétain, who was leading the French general staff at that point. He essentially says to Joffre, we need every man here. They'll cycle men in and out. The battle lasts for like 9 months. When you guys picture these battles, you have to picture battles lasting for months. And it becomes a place where virtually every French soldier spends some time, and it's absolutely horrifying, honestly. I only have 20 more minutes today, but Battle of Verdun, it's a tactical victory for the French, but a strategic victory for the Germans. Ominous foreshadowing when I say that the French are not going to be willing to continue to be thrown into the sausage grinder like this for long. This is 1916. In 1917, the French troops are going to mutiny all along the lines, because Pétain is going to once again basically throw them into another series of bloodbaths, this time called the Nivelle Offensive. Defenders have an overwhelming superiority at this point in warfare. And the general staff still believe that they need to take the offensive, gain the military initiative. And part of this is for political reasons, part of this is frankly for their own career reasons. And the soldiers have enough of this. And it's really only the entry of the Americans into the war and the fresh influx of supplies and morale and a change in leadership. Frankly, the baton is relieved, and Ferdinand Foch will take control of the army. And that gets the French back into the field. But for a minute there, it looks like the French may just capitulate. Really quickly, also in 1916, we have the only major naval engagement of the war, which may sound strange because I spent a significant, several minutes last lecture talking about the naval buildup at sea, right? And how the British and the Germans were building these enormous battle fleets who were going to square off with each other, right? Of Admiral Jellicoe, it was said he was the only man who could lose the war in a single afternoon. He was the British commander of naval forces. Because, of course, if the Germans had won, the British were effectively done. Jellicoe locates the British fleet in the North Sea. It's a very foggy day, and it's near dusk, and there's an exchange, and the Germans are essentially chased back to port, from whence they do not emerge again. And so, even though, again, tactical victory maybe for the Germans because they sunk a little bit more tonnage than the British, it's a major strategic victory for Britain because they confined the German naval assets to port. The Germans will then be forced to rely on U-boat warfare, and this is going to play a large part in bringing the United States into the war, of course, which I assume most of you already know. Yes?
Do the Allied powers have anything comparable to the U-boats? Or is that just a German thing?
Yeah, they do. But one of the things that necessity, right? Necessity compels innovation, and the Germans were masterful innovators, and they were essentially compelled to fight war and to innovate in this way. I haven't gotten a chance to talk about things like gas, right? The Germans are going to bring gas onto the battlefield. So the Germans were technologically the most advanced society around at this point, yes, and they did have dominance under the oceans. But again, this was considered kind of cowardly and despicable way to fight. Certainly by the English, right? The English don't like this, and the Americans don't like it either. Because while the British are, I guess I can talk a little bit about this. So the British have decided to blockade Germany following the Battle of Jutland. Actually, this works perfectly together. Battle of Jutland, they eliminate the German surface fleet. They are going to now blockade Germany. However, it's clearly a violation of international law at the time, the way they did it. And they had actual Hague conventions in the lead up to this, where they were trying to write down rules for okay, we won't drop bombs on civilian cities, we won't gas each other. It was understood that these are things that could be in the offing. They weren't here yet, but a man of very simple imagination could imagine that this might be something that comes up, so we're not going to do this. Well, one of the things was, we're supposed to respect neutral flagged shipping. The British do not do this, however. The British essentially say anything bound for Germany under whatever flag whatsoever, because things like contraband were obviously not accepted. If you're a neutral ship bringing military equipment to Germany, obviously that was considered fair game, but they're stopping everything. Everything. And they're trying to starve Germany into submission. And so that is why the Germans resort to U-boat warfare. It is not really entirely the reason that the United States comes in. We'll talk about this next time on Wednesday. But when this is generally taught, it's there was the sinking of the Lusitania and then the U.S. went to war. The sinking of the Lusitania happens in early 1915. The United States doesn't come into the war for another 2 years. One thing that I do want to highlight next time is the Zimmerman note, the Zimmerman telegram. Because this is something that kind of gets passed by as this, it was a no. That was actually something that was kind of a real gift to those in the United States who wanted to go into war. And there was a very serious war caucus led actually by Wall Street, because Wall Street banks were lending tons and tons and tons of money to Great Britain. And now I've gone and talked about a bunch of things I said I wasn't going to talk about this. I still have 15 minutes though. So bear all that in mind. Bear all that in mind. There's a great connection. There's a great connection there. Battle of Verdun, Battle of Jutland. Battle of the Somme, yes. Battle of the Somme. 1916 is the worst year of the war in terms of fatalities. In terms of casualties, you had Verdun and the Battle of the Somme there. This is again another one of those situations where you just have tactics being used that are just not appreciative of the advances in industrial technology. You have the British commanders believing that by bombarding the German entrenchments, these earthworks and barbed wire, this is another great invention. Basically, the war was defined by the shovel, the machine gun, and barbed wire, right? The machine guns that can just, cover the field in bullets, trenches from which defenders can hide behind, and then barbed wire. Barbed wire had been invented, which could prevent men from easily charging across the field, right? You have to imagine, guys, have any of you ever dealt with barbed wire? Very nasty stuff, very nasty stuff. And you have to imagine just tens of thousands of pounds of coiled barbed wire rolled all across these lines, so you're having to pick your way through. Well, the British general staff believed that by bombarding them with explosive shells over a period of weeks, they could destroy the barbed wire, which of course, that didn't work, of course. Which, sitting here today, it's very easy to say, like, well, duh, that didn't work. But the British lose something like 70,000 casualties in like 48 hours. So, when you talk about the lost generation, the British upper class, they served as officers, right? And so they led their men at the front, and so they were shot down first. And about a third of the graduates of Oxford and Eton colleges over that period would die in the war. Of French babies, male babies born in 1890, about a third of them will be killed in the war. So I mean, you have these huge population shifts and imbalances that are going to affect European growth and demographics for the rest of the century, right? You think about all the widows, all the babies who weren't born. So this is something that we'll obviously have occasion to talk about later. Really, the next several lectures are unfortunately occupied with things like war and depression, and when the dust really finally settles in the 1950s, we're going to have like a taking stock lecture to see and kind of play counterfactual. Like, what would European population growth and economy have looked like had these wars not happened? Because, of course, the idea that war benefits the economy is the great illusion. Book at the time by Norman Angell. Okay, Battle of the Somme. And then in March 1917, the Tsar is going to abdicate. I'm going to really quickly take you through what was going on over there. So, I had said, wow, the Russians really get into the field very quickly. And that freaks out Moltke the Younger, who takes some army corps away from the right wing and sends them back east to stop the Russians. That doesn't happen. Battle of Tannenberg. The Germans smashed them. And this is going to be this is going to turn a fellow who's going to be with us for some time now, Erich Ludendorff, is going to turn he and Hindenburg into national names, national heroes. They were the great winners of that victory against the Russians. And this is going to buy them the time that they had needed to win the war in the West, which of course they don't. The British come into the war, which the German war plan had assumed they would not. So everything kind of went awry there. But in March 1970, over the next couple of years, so that's 1914, over the next 3 years, what's going to happen? A series of things. Number one, the Tsar's government is going to pour guys into the field, often poorly equipped, right? Often, frankly, rather poorly led. They don't have the best generals. As I said, they do have a couple, specifically Brusilov, who is going to launch an offensive, which really is sweeping into Austria, and it looks like there's going to be real problems, except that they can't re-provision him. And so the offensive kind of just peters out. And the Brusilov offensive was actually just the year before this. And there's inside Russia, again, you have the internal political dynamics are impeding the war effort. Because Russians, as I mentioned last time, they're used to winning wars. They've done virtually nothing but win wars until recently. And it looks like what's keeping them from winning more wars is the totally inefficient, corrupt, and useless government of the Tsar, with his probably treasonous wife, who's a German princess, right? And that weirdo Rasputin, who's whispering poisonous things into their ears. And of course, Rasputin will be murdered during this time, right, by an Oxford-educated Russian prince. And that whole assassination is just bizarro. It's almost
Dude wouldn't die.
Yeah, it's a totally tragicomic. They try and poison him, it's not working. They shoot him, and then they think they got him, but then he comes staggering up the stairs. It's just this, it's almost too unbelievable to believe, but it definitely happened. And so you have these patriotic groups of businessmen coming forward and saying, please, let us help you win this war. And the Tsar and his advisors, the Tsar's advisors are saying, don't do that. This is the thin wedge of liberalism. You let them in before long, you're just going to be sitting in a golden cage like the English monarch, not making any real decisions. And so instead he goes into a real cage until he is executed by Lenin. Pick your poison. What was that quote we had from Napoleon III? If you march at the head of the forces of your century, they will carry you with them. If you march behind them, they will drag you along, and if you march against them, they will overthrow you. It's quite true, quite true. Key inventions, we talked about the introduction of poison gas at Ypres. This is just horrifying stuff. I mean, even just the smallest bit of this will paralyze and burn the lungs. They basically choke you to death. You drown, basically. Gas masks on the battlefield. That's 1915. And this is so horrifying that even though all governments will plan for more chemical warfare in the Second World War, no one actually uses it on the battlefield. Obviously, Hitler will gas people, and then the Italians have no problem gassing colonial people, which we'll talk about. But none of the powers in Europe use gas. In part, that might be because of the very quick nature of war on the Western Front in World War II, but no gas. Airplanes are on the battlefield, but they're mostly being used for reconnaissance now and dogfighting. They're not advanced enough yet that they can carry huge payloads of bombs and go decimate civilian cities. And this is and I say civilian cities, right? Of course they're civilian cities, right? That's kind of a oxymoronic. Of course it's a civilian city, but what's located in the cities? Factories. Yes. And these are total wars, right? These are total wars. You need materiel. Is materiel that's going to go to the front and help kill your soldiers a viable target? Your own population certainly thinks so, right? And so of course you start bombing. You can't do that in World War I. Airplanes are mostly used for reconnaissance and dogfighting at this point. The most famous pilot, of course, is the Red Baron. He gets like 70 confirmed kills. He's eventually shot down and killed, and the British bury him in full honors. Tanks. Tanks come to the battlefield on the Somme, and sadly, again, you just have these old generals with their fixed way of thinking. They just view the tanks as just kind of this interesting mechanical contraption. Churchill says something along the lines of like, they're fancy, pretty toys, but not of any real use. When, of course, what happens at the Somme is these tanks, when they eventually bring them out, they smash right through the barbed wire. The German guys flee in terror because what on earth are these things? But the British didn't have enough of them with them there, and they had no real tactical sense of like how to deploy armored divisions effectively. And so the breakthrough kind of amounts to nothing, and they eventually stall out, and the Germans storm back in, and the bloodletting keeps going on. And this is a great quote here that you'll see on your PowerPoint. After the failure of the Battle of the Marne, the failure of the Germans to take Paris, Kaiser Wilhelm confided to his diary, "The war is lost. It may go on for a long time yet, but it is lost. The Schlieffen plan to quickly knock out France and then turn around and quickly defeat the Russians has failed. This was how they had won their prior generation of wars. They created a unified Germany. It was their plan for successfully winning this two-front war that they all sort of thought was coming. Those sort of lightning tactics are, of course, how Hitler is going to win his major battles as well. So, the twin turnings of 1917. While the French are dealing with mutinies in the trenches because they've been thrown into yet another series of meat grinders by these officers who are aristocrats. Remember, France is the home of social revolutionary ferment, and who are your leaders? They're the officer class, right? They're not the commoners. They generally come from money and from the old nobility, right? Like it is an open thing. We talked about there is meritocracy, there is mobility, but especially in Italy, there's going to be these weird dynamics of like rich, ennobled northerners basically throwing these illiterate, ethnically different peasant southerners into these meat grinders like they're nothing, right? there's a very famous passage that comes from Christopher Clark, who wrote a popular book about this. I remember it stood out to me years ago when I read it. Of the Austrians at one point just stopping at Caporetto and saying, like, please, like, will you stop throwing these waves of guys at us, because like just blasting them to pieces. If you want a very interesting kind of, it's fictional obviously, but A Farewell to Arms, if you've read that Hemingway book, Caporetto, that is the battle that they're retreating from, where the officers are literally executing guys for leaving. That's why the officers carry pistols, right? They don't carry rifles, because rifles are for shooting the enemy. Pistols are for shooting disobedient soldiers. 1917, well, if the French have a problem, the Russians have a huge problem. The Russians are very sick of dying by the hundreds of thousands with no end in sight, no real prospect of victory either. They're running out of everything. There's food riots all over the place. Inflation is out of control. You know, again, at least on the Western Front, you have American aid and supplies coming in. One of the things that totally demoralizes the Germans is they make this big push and they take some French salients, and what do they find there? Tins of canned meats and all of these things, and they're eating like crusts of old moldy bread back there, and they realize like it's over. Like the infinite wealth of America is fueling the Entente side by 1917, and that it's only a matter of time before Germany is ultimately crushed. They often would say, defeated? No, we were not defeated. As soldiers, we were the best. We were simply crushed by overwhelming force, and that is effectively what happens. Even when the Americans come into the war next time, as we'll see, the Americans don't bring any like great new strategic or tactical thinking. They just bring a bunch more guys to dump in there. And the Americans, even though they only fight on one front for one war, will lose almost 200,000 guys. That's how bloody this fighting is in World War I. The Americans will only lose slightly more than they lose about 500,000 in World War II, but that's fighting on multiple fronts in multiple theaters for multiple years. So, 1917, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. How did the Bolsheviks come to power? We're going to talk more about this next time. Kerensky's government, because the Bolsheviks are initially only a minority party. It's funny because the word Bolshevik means literally majority, like majority rule, even though the Bolsheviks are a minority. Kerensky's government is initially a coalition government, and the most popular socialist government are the SRs. They are supporting the war effort, though. The reason they're supporting the war effort, though, is because, in the words of Palmerston, states have permanent interests, no matter who is governing them. And when Kerensky was asked later, why didn't you leave the war? All you had to do to prevent Lenin from taking power was get out of the war. And he said, well, we couldn't do that to our allies, couldn't abandon our commitments that we made. Well, what commitment had they made to them? They had promised the Russians that they would have Constantinople and the Straits. And remember, that had been what the Crimean War was basically fought over, was to prevent the Russians from getting into the Straits, because they didn't want the Russians having access to the Mediterranean. The British at this point have decided, you know what, Russians in the Mediterranean is better than Germans in India. We'll promise them the Straits. They ripped this up, obviously, as soon as Lenin takes power. Because one of the things that Lenin is going to do when he takes power is, in the October coup, which we're going to talk about, is he says, we're making peace. What the people want is peace. The people want land, bread, and peace. Okay? So they borrowed the land idea, and I'm getting way ahead of myself here, but basically, the Bolshevik platform had said state ownership of land. The popular land program came from the SR, the SR party. And they had said, give the land to the village commune, and then they parcel it out to the peasants. And then food and peace. The war is crazy unpopular. And Lenin's party is the only one who will get them out of the war. And so, quick question, does anyone know? Lenin is not in Russia when all this is going on. He's in Switzerland. How does he get back to Russia? Who helps him get back to Russia?
Wasn't it Germany or Austria?
The German government realizes, man, if only there was someone in power in Russia who would cut a deal with us. Nobody seems to want to. And so they smuggle Lenin back into Russia with the hopes, kind of fingers crossed, like maybe by some wild chance he can take power and take Russia out of the war. And that's exactly what happens. So kind of crazy, because that's really a shot in the dark. They do a similar thing with Pilsudski. And if you look at your reading, I believe it was last week, there's a quote at the start. You know how each of the chapters in Hopalong starts with a quote? Pilsudski is one of the guys who has a quote there. And he's a Polish nationalist who he's essentially put into place to counter those Polish nationalists that the Entente were trying to make friends with. Remember, Poland doesn't exist at this point, right? But Poland is going to be recreated. And they're both kind of trying to posture here in a post-war settlement, because the Germans don't realize at this point that they're going to be effectively crippled by the peace settlement, because they're looking at Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson is calling for a peace based on 14 points, right? A peace of no winners and no losers, right? And that is what the Germans are going to surrender on the basis of. It's a little more complicated than that, and if they actually believe that, they were being a little naive and a little myopic and not actually looking at the broader context of Wilson's claims and ideas. And certainly they weren't taking into account that Wilson was not in a position to actually dictate what was going to happen to the peace. That is all for next week. Wednesday when we meet, we are going to bring the Americans into the war. We are going to shove the Russians out of the war, because we are going to talk about the Russian Revolution, which I know some of you are very interested in talking about. We will talk more about the Russian Revolution in our lectures moving into the 20s, because the Russian Revolution is actually a very lengthy process, right? Again, when you get taught it in high school, it's kind of like, well, you know, the soldiers shot some people and they mutinied, and then the Tsar was executed and the Soviet Union was there now, right? Not what happened.
There was a whole civil war.
Even before the Civil War, right? We have the period of the provisional government. Then we have the actual coup by the Bolsheviks to take power. Then we have years of civil war, right, between the Reds and the Whites. But then you also have wars amongst the former elements of the Russian Empire that are going to become Soviet republics, right? Because initially Lenin is going to argue that we should let the nationalities have their own states, but at the same time he has Joseph Yugashvili, Joseph Stalin, creating Soviets inside the countries, which these were workers' councils, who were then going to undermine those very governments to help bring communist governments who would be under Moscow's control and to bring them into their orbit. So there's a lot there. I wanted to leave some time for questions. We have about 6-7 minutes. Hit me with some questions and thoughts. Let's hear it. What do we got? A lot today. The first day of World War I. I've said I think it is the most pivotal conflict, right? At the start of this war, the Europeans are the center of economic, political, cultural power. They control large swathes of the developing world. This is going to destroy all of that, right? Out of this war are going to be born the USSR, fascist republic in Italy, which I guess is, Italy is complicated. We talked about it being a process. In Italy, it's going to be a process too, because it's like, well, the war was unpopular, and then Mussolini came to power, and he was Hitler's friend. More complicated than that. The creation of the USSR, it's a process, but it all comes out of the First World War. Again, Nazi Germany, a product of the First World War. And what was the First World War fought over? Ah, if only we knew, right? Franz Josef, ah, if only we knew, right? Any questions, comments, or concerns? Yes?
On the first slide, it was talking about who's in what block.
Oh, yeah.
What exactly is Japan doing throughout
Oh, yes, great question. Okay.
Maybe taking over
Great. Yes, Japan. So Japan, at this point, is quite alienated, and it's a good point here because they're not pleased with the French, or the Russians, or the British, or the Americans, because they've just fought this series of wars against the Chinese, the first Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s, and then the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-1905, and the Entente powers of World War I forced them to give a bunch of these gains back and are very clearly trying to prevent Japan from becoming too powerful. But the Japanese leadership recognized they're going to be tied down. They quickly realized they're going to be tied down in Europe. And what we can do is we can help ourselves to the German colonies over here. So the Germans, for example, have possessions in China, which is already where Japanese strategic thinkers are looking. They're thinking, okay, if we push out into the Pacific, that might bring us into conflict with the United States. Remember, the United States now has the Philippines, which they got in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. So they're looking to get a captive colonial market for themselves. What made Britain, a medium-sized island, so powerful? Well, it was possession of India. Well, we're a medium-sized island, so we need an India, but the British already have India. China will be our India. And so they're already, I was just reading a great book on this the other day, about specifically this period and Japanese strategic thinking here. They're thinking already about taking Manchuria, which will eventually happen in the 20s and 30s. But they're already laying the groundwork for that. So they're going to take things like Shandong, which was a German possession. And at the end of the war, this is actually going to be critical to the May 4th movement in China, which is obviously way outside this class, but basically the Chinese are going to get bribed into the war. The Chinese Republican government, because the imperial government has been overthrown in 1911, 1912, the Republican government is going to be bribed into the war by Wilson saying, listen, if you help the Entente powers, we will treat China right, basically. China is still living under the, quote-unquote unequal treaties. The Western powers still have extraterritorial rights and possessions there, and they're actually collecting Chinese tax revenue from the ports still. So like the central government doesn't even have access to all of its money that it needs to like run a bureaucracy and a military and stuff. And there's a lot of warlords running around China at this point that the central government would love to crush. For example, Sun Yat-sen, the initial leader, he basically has to hand power over to one of these military warlords because he has no way of stopping him or preventing him, and so he basically is trying to prevent a civil war from breaking out by basically making him his successor. It doesn't work, tragically, but that was his thinking there. So yes, that's what Japan is doing. At the end of during the treaty negotiations, Wilson is going to pressure the Japanese to give up those possessions. Say, come on, the Chinese, we made these promises to the Chinese. And the Japanese will just say, well, you want us in this League of Nations thing, which was Wilson's top priority, right? The League of Nations. You guys know about that. We're going to get into it if you don't know it. Again, this is a European history class. It is a forerunner to the UN. It is an attempt at, supranational government, which is what the EU is an effort at doing here. So I will talk about it, but I'm trying not to make this a class about Wilson and European history. But it is Wilson's fault primarily that the Habsburg Empire is destroyed. Wilson is a Princeton political scientist, and he's obsessed with this idea of national self-determination, right? And so Churchill is someone who's arguing, no, we should keep the Habsburgs in power because none of these little successor states that we're going to see set up are going to last or be able to stand up to a revisionist Germany or Russia, which, spoiler alert, that is exactly what happens, right? And they're also going to fight like crazy among each other over territory. But Wilson is determined that the Austro-Hungarian Empire would be broken up, that they were the chief aggressor in the war, actually. And yes, it's very interesting. There's a great book about this that basically says, it's interesting because you have the Austrian Habsburgs who were representative of that ancien regime, that old medievalist regime, coming into the modern period, coming into conflict with the United States, right? Which is going to eventually be the supreme power that concludes the war. So Austria, the ancien regime power, starts the war. The liberal capitalist democracy United States ends the war. And so he ties basically these things together into this interesting arc. Yes, so great question about Japan. And so Wilson is basically going to say, well, sorry, China, I really need Japan in this League of Nations because otherwise, if not everybody's in it, then what is it for? Which, of course, is ironic because who doesn't ratify the treaty?
Japan.
Oh, no, Japan does, but the United States.
But
Wilson comes back to the United States, and Wilson, he's terrible in politics. Basically, he alienates all the Republicans in Congress who he needs to support the treaty. Because people like Lodge, Henry Cabot Lodge, aren't opposed to the treaty per se. They want to see revisions to make sure that the United States is not going to be technically committed to fight to maintain what everyone already can see is not going to be a stable peace in Europe. Before the ink is even dry. John Maynard Keynes, of course, writes the famous critique of the peace, but numerous people, even as it was being negotiated, said, are you kidding me? Like, this is never going to work. This is totally unworkable. And so, yes, the United States does not have a treaty. The United States is the one power that if it had agreed to underwrite it, maybe it would have worked, but they don't, spoiler alert, and we get everything.
Japan walked out though, right?
Japan does walk out because of in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Japan and Italy and Germany are all going to walk out. All the revisionist powers are going to walk out. Yes.
I don't know.
Oh, I thought you were saying. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to open the discussion board today early. So if anyone has any thoughts or questions or comments or anything, jump on there and put them on there or say, hey, next time will you talk about this? Or hey, Friday for the discussion board, can we talk about this? I absolutely want to include you in this. This is an upper level class. You all know what's going on here. Okay, great. I look forward to seeing you all Wednesday.
You want me to stop this?
You guys go ahead. I'm going to cut this. I'm gonna cut me walking away from it. I'm gonna cut you all leaving. I may link them all together with next time's video and then the World War II videos. See you all later.